Get up there, you can put it, just rest
Right.
it on
Oh,
this.
okay. And then to advance it is
Yes,
this.
We're
Oh, there.
going to continue with our program. Our next speaker is Elena Sparrow, who I think many of you may know. Elena is at the International Arctic Research Center in Fairbanks. And Elena is going to share with us some of the outcomes and some thoughts about the education and outreach activities that took place during the International Polar Year. Take it away.
Thank you, Gail, for, I need to be here. Thank you, Gail, for the invitation to come. This is my first time in Rhode Island. And just to say a little bit about myself, I'm originally from the Philippines, but I have lived now in the Arctic, subarctic, for more than 30 years. So I guess I'm an Alaskan now too. And I'm a soil microbiologist. That's where my science training is, my PhD. But I have been also working in informal and formal science education, and was very much involved during the International Polar Year as part of the University of the Arctic Higher Education Outreach Office. And I took it over from Martin Jeffries when he went to work for NSF. Okay. So just to a reminder of the, if you've forgotten about the beehive, or the honeycomb schematic maps the IPY projects to their central area of research and geographical area. And it always still impresses me because that's one of the distinguishing features of the fourth IPY is the inclusion of human dimensions and also the inclusion of education outreach. First time ever out of the 4 IPYs. And so there are, I think, 34 IPY clusters that were proposed, and more projects were added, and some were not funded, and so it kind of evens out. But there were a lot, and then of course, whether projects are in the Arctic or in both geographic areas or in the Antarctic. This is, and I'm sorry if you have a hard time seeing it, but I'll just kind of mention a few. This is a activity topic headings from the Polar Science and Global Climate, an international resource for education and outreach. A book or a guide was produced by the Education Outreach Committee and scientists. So it's educators and scientists have worked on this because it's a guide for both educators and scientists on how to do science outreach, education outreach, whether formal or informal. And so there's activities, and there's the events that was. So there are many activities that could be done, just in local areas. But then the Education Outreach Committee had what they call polar events, which was the Polar Days, and so example of that is the one International Polar Day was on polar oceans, and so again, the importance of teaming up of scientists and educators. So the flyers, there's 2 pages, the basics of what, where, why, and when, and how. And then on the second page is an introduction to the science of the polar day. And then activities that educators, whether formal or informal, could do with their students or their group. And even actually, I think some adults profited from some of the activities because the science concepts in the Arctic, wasn't, especially those who have never been to the Arctic, come across better with activities that they can do and understand. And some, like parents, I suppose in museums, where parents go and then they say, oh, I've got to bring my children here. And it actually is, beneficial not only for the students, but for the parents too. And so it happens too in the International Polar Days. And then the other thing is to make the science accessible, the translation of these flyers into different languages. And these were all done by volunteers. And so the size of the words, the thinner they are, like the smallest size is for like one polar event, and then the larger ones are for more events that were translated, and 100. So out of 25 languages, 116 of these flyers in different languages were produced for use in the polar, and it was disseminated through the web because it was for different countries. And then participants were invited, so to whether it's individuals or groups, to mark their places by a balloon. So on that, on this one, it's an example of People Day. At that time, they had a on-screen limit of 200 points, and so that was increased later because they realized that it was too small. There were more and more participants, more and more people and groups wanting to participate. There was also a media analysis done by a graduate student for her master's thesis, Communication of Science to an International Public. And she, part of her thesis was the examination of mass media about the IPY. And so she broke it down into different categories, from online news, online science, TV, radio, and paper and print and online resources. So it was very telling because there were all kinds of activities and media. Different kinds of media that were being used for the IPY. So on the outcomes of IPY Education and Outreach, it was really clear that it was important to have a coordinating office and personnel. It was a small office. It was like 3 people in there, but and it was a tall order to coordinate this worldwide. But it was done with a lot of volunteer people from educators and scientists working on, Arctic or polar science projects, but also just some of them have never been to the Arctic. So we had members. So what they did was, from the core, from the coordinating office, then they formed a committee, Education Outreach Communication Committee, and asked for who might want to join and have the time to do it. And so we were a team from all over the world, including from Malaysia and Brazil and Portugal, places where they haven't been to the Arctic, but they were, very much interested. And of course, they learned a lot by being part of it. And then the volunteers got enthused and learned more, then they also attracted more volunteers to join. And because there were so many different occasions for being engaged. And then the enthusiasm and the dedication of scientists and educators was also one of the key. It was a key outcome as well as an activation of how it's hooking, how to hook people, especially because the one of the things that IPY was emphasizing was the preparation of future polar scientists for the next, IPY, or for continuing the studies on the polar regions, and then the ability to reach and serve a variety of target audiences from K-12 to undergraduates, graduate students, and early career scientists, community members, tribal members, general public, and scientists, because scientists also learned how to be involved in how to do. Some of them have never done education outreach, and in fact was kind of scared to be before younger students, and what do I tell them as a scientist, and how do I relate to them? And so there were educators to help them, and then the scientists who were working with educators were able to help educators who've never, they held the scientists in awe and kind of, on a pedestal and saying, I don't know how to relate to this person. We might not even have any common things to talk about. And so it was a really good synergistic combination. And then a variety of methods, whether formal and informal education. And then a lot of you, I'm glad to see, that are part of here, the museums. There were also traveling exhibits, there were films, there were advertisements. It seemed like advertisements because they were in buses and trains that were going from one place to another, and actually geographically moving information from one place to another. And then the Polar Palooza, and Stephanie was involved in that, where a group of scientists and Arctic members, indigenous members, went around to talk about what's happening in the Arctic and about research and important things that is related to what's happening in their own place. And then the two, I guess you would say, infrastructure or organizations that have come out from the IPY is the APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. It started then, but now they even have a secretariat and it's funded. And then the Polar Educators International saw that example, and so after IPY and during the 2012 IPY meeting in Canada, the Polar Educators International formed, and it has done many activities. We meet, I'm part of both. Polar educators have been meeting every 3 years in different places, and of course we're always looking for funding to bring educators to that, especially from non-polar countries, so that they would know more about the Arctic and Antarctic. But the APEX, they did a lot of training, and it's still going on, and they are continuing the polar days, but now it's gone into polar weeks, because it's important to have asynchronous and synchronous activities because of the different parts of the world, the time frames, time zones. And I remember we took turns when we would have the Education Outreach Committee meetings to who's going to do the midnight and 1 a.m. Turn, because then, you know, it's ideal for some, and then it's really bad time. And we've had people say that a mother, she says, so I don't wake up the household and my kids, I'm in the bathroom talking to this international planning, you know, what our next events are. And so, let's see. So there is continuing polar science education and outreach. A lot of the projects were funded and continued beyond 2007-2008 IPY years. I had the monitoring seasons through global learning communities, reaching 51 educators in 51 countries. And now we have another project. The first one was NSF funded, and now it's NASA funded, and it's on the feedbacks and impacts of a warming Arctic, engaging learners in STEM using the GLOBE program and other NASA resources and assets. And so in this program, new project, we're engaging teams of not just educators, but educators, community members, and youth leaders. We have a significant high rate of turnover of teachers, especially in the rural areas in Alaska. And so we're thinking that if we engage the community members, they have a stake in that, and that they would not only learn about the impacts of climate change, that they could do a stewardship project to have learning with an impact and address an issue, climate change related issue, in their own places. And one of the ways that we started with Alaska, and now we have also invited teams from outside Alaska. So we have had teams from Oregon, Montana, Washington, and let's see, North Dakota. And so we encourage, especially, we're trying to reach indigenous populations and underserved. And so we're trying to encourage a member of the indigenous community to be part of the team. And one of the things that we asked them to do is to take a climate change in my community course. The workshop is part of the course, but they don't get the grade until after they have implemented into the classroom or community. And at least one of them is required to sign up for the course. And of course, everybody, contributes to that, because sometimes, you get really very enthusiastic response to workshops, but it takes a hard time and a team to start it when you're back in your own, school. And so that's one of the lessons we have learned in other projects. And we are continuing also not just professional development for teachers and community members and youth leaders, but also for early career scientists. So they come to our workshops and share their polar science, and so they get a chance to communicate their science, and the teachers, of course, love having scientists talk about their research. And actually, we go out to the field and do some research that's related to what the scientists are learning. We've had other projects, the Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. that Stephanie led, and I was also involved in it. And so we had several different projects that was increased awareness, from awareness to informing decisions, from the classroom to the general public, and from low tech to high tech, from playing cards, and to one that Margie has been involved in on the Polar Explorer, where you can, if you're interested in that, Margie would be able to explain more about it. But I was involved in the one of the projects, which is the Reaching Arctic Communities Facing Climate Change. And so the target audience were Alaska Native adults, primarily from rural communities. And so we had, besides scientists, we had actually elders and natural resources management people, and educators come to that. And we also experienced the impact of, so we were supposed to have 3 camps. And the camp is a nice, safe place for discussion and a trusting place. And instead of going to the university, it was held at a spirit camp that was owned by one of the elders who established it because he wanted young people to come and learn more about what the elders know, and so that they can pass on that knowledge. And so we had, because there was a fire in between the 3 years that we were going to do this, we had some other engagement events. We had Interior Women's Exchange on climate change, and Indigenous Exchange on climate change. And so learning from the other the other climate change education projects, that key influentials, it's important to get in touch with key influentials in the community. So women, Indigenous women, there's some women, young and older women who are leaders on this. Okay, so just to some of the references that I used for this presentation, and I thank you. Yeah. So if you have questions. Yes.
Do you find that setting that you just described, going out to the camp, that the program that you're designing fully has a complementary nature of integrating traditional knowledge? For example, that they do a lot of monitoring anyway, that fits in nicely with Western science.
Yes, it does, and that's one of the things that we're learning, and it's a long, slow process. The co-production of knowledge, I mean, in a real way, and so like when we had the camp, usually when we say, oh, we're going to have both traditional and Western science, usually they start with the Western science, but no, with our camps and now with our workshops, we start with the Indigenous, giving them and recognizing that their knowledge is equal and valued and respected. And so there's so many lessons that we're learning, giving space and time in the programming, because sometimes we say, oh, we got to cover all these concepts, or we need to cover all this, but there is also a timing and a rhythm, a different rhythm for Indigenous knowledge when it's being shared, and taking that all into consideration. It's really, I'm on a steep learning curve, and I'm blessed to have a Indigenous partner who person who has partnered with me in our effort in that reaching Arctic communities facing climate change. She is from the interior also. She's a Athabascan Deghitan tribe, and we are all aware of that, which I didn't know before. That I thought, oh, if I know from one tribe, then I know, then I can do it. No, it's different. Different tribes have different ways, and even the elders would not assume, like an elder from one village would not assume that he is generalizing over the other villages, because they say, you know, they have their own way, and they or markers of predicting weather, and you know, by the landmark and by the types of clouds that they see, and so it's really conforming it to the audience, you know, that we are trying to reach. Yes.
Can you describe ways in which indigenous knowledge is translated into some way that audiences or scientists can actually access it without the one-to-one kind of interaction that happens in the workshop? What are the ways in which we could learn more about what that knowledge is?
Right. So there was a project at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the Project Jukebox, where they have been recording conversations with elders, and you know, their knowledge. And I know in one of my NASA projects, we had interviewed elders from different places, and so it's digitized. And people can listen to that, and different villages have recordings. Some, I think more and more are being shared, but in some places they don't want to, because they say there is a time for, you know, even in educating their own people, there's a time and an age, or appropriate age and time for when to share certain things. And so I know, but there's still now, there's more of it now recorded, and that can be shared and available. Yes.
Oh, I would just add that I'm also from Alaska, the Alaska Native Knowledge Network.
Oh, yes.
Is an online
Yes. Repository.
source. And then I actually produced a radio series that was part of IPY called Encounters, Radio Experiences in the North, and that was a radio series that integrated, or tried to integrate Western science with Native knowledge. And there's lots and lots of programs still.
Yes.
And those are they all have tags on them, and searchable, and so if you're interested in a particular area, you can go in and find what the background knowledge.
Well, the Encounters programs are just on the web listed as topics. And Alaska Native Knowledge, it kind of goes up and down with
Right.
how accessible.
Because yeah, it takes funding to have a person kind of curate. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just wanted to add to that, this Project Jukebox is run through University of Alaska Fairbanks. It's a library, so that is
Yes.
all searchable, and it's tagged with search words and stuff. And the library is also working really hard to get some of the older tapes digitized with transcripts and everything. And they've been doing a bunch of that as well. So that's all becoming searchable. And everything that has the permissions.
Yes. Yes.
It's
That's
not everything does. There are a lot of old tapes that you can go and you can listen to, but they are not open.
right.
They're not, yeah.
Because of the permissions. Yes.
One more question. I have one question.
Oh.
Are the IPY education resources archived in one-stop shopping somewhere that folks here can access?
I have to check that, because it is.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
so they still have a remnant website with,
Yeah.
with a lot of the material on it. It's not being maintained necessarily, but because it kind of stopped at the end of IPY, the materials are there.
Yeah. And
We can get that info and share.
Yeah.
right. Because also there was talk of, you know, transferring it to Apex or the PEI, because they now have somebody. Yes.
There was the National Academy did a Lessons and Legacies of the International Polar Year,
Oh.
and so some of the highlights are collected. It's a couple years after it, so they're sort of reflective about some of the successes.
Yeah, that's
Thank
right.
you, Elena.
Yeah. I am a Dutch.
So one of the reasons that we really wanted Elena to share with you was because there are a lot of resources that have been developed. And we have a very bad habit in the world of education and outreach of reinventing the wheel and recreating materials over and over, right? Everyone, I see a lot of heads nodding. And so we'll do our best to find the connection to where these materials are archived so that we can share that with you. So we're now going to go into a breakout group.